All right, next I want to talk about economic geography in North America, just some basic concepts of, and one thing I want to introduce is the concept of industry sectors. And economic geography is about the distribution, spatial organization of economic activity. And one way we organize that is through what we call economic sectors. Primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector. And I'll go through these individually and provide some examples. So primary sectors is really harvesting commodities from nature, farming especially. It could be fishing or timber or drilling for oil. Secondary is sort of a next step up where so the idea with primary is that you're extracting things from nature. Secondary is really manufacturing, where you're taking the extracted products and you're making them into something new. Factory work, also construction. And then the next layer up is tertiary, which is really parts of the service economy. Waiters, doctors, lawyers, what I'm doing right now, part of the service economy. So primary industries, you're harvesting or using commodities from nature. So people, farming, oil workers, miners, fishermen, these are examples of primary industries. And the reason why we're talking about this is we're going to see how the number of people working in these different industries has changed over time. Now, kind of a step above these primary industries is secondary industries. And oftentimes we call these blue-collar jobs. The idea of these are that you take commodities from nature and you increase their value. So if you raise crops, if you farm, you're primary. But if you work in food processing, that would be secondary, like canning tomatoes or processing chicken. So food processing, manufacturing, refineries. So if you drill for oil, you're primary. If you work in a refinery, secondary. Construction work would fall into this as well. Then lastly, you have the tertiary sector, what we call the service part of the economy. And instead of providing material goods, what you're doing is some sort of service for people. Government, hospitality, cashiers, hotel workers, education, healthcare. There's a wide variety, and some might even divide this into different, into maybe up higher, like quaternary and so on. But we can kind of lump all this in what we call the service economy. All right. So let's take a moment to look at this. So what we have here is these are more developed countries, more industrialized countries like the United States. So we can kind of let's just say this is the United States. It'll be close enough. And these are less developed countries, maybe countries in Africa or Latin America, countries that didn't industrialize as early. Okay, so this is the 1820s. In the 1820s, all countries, most people farmed. People were farmers primarily. And very few people worked in the tertiary or secondary parts of the economy. Now, what changed during the Industrial Revolution is that you started to have an increase in people working in factories, also in services, and less of a percentage of people working in farming. That you had a switch in industrialized countries where we had less farmers, more factory workers, more people in the service economy. Now, in countries that did not industrialize early, they remained in the old pattern where most people were farming and fewer people worked in factories until about here, around 1970. Around 1970, you start to have a real change with what we call globalization, the moving of factories overseas. This is a period in the United States called deindustrialization, where you see our secondary stops growing and actually starts to decline. That factory work started to decline since the 1970s in the United States and increased in other parts of the world. So this is, for example, where maybe Now, instead of making cars in Detroit, they're made in Mexico, or they're made in Thailand, or some other part of the world, and then re-exported to the United States. And you can kind of see this happening over time. And this is showing kind of the change in employment in the United States. And so that probably the one thing I would do if we were sitting in the classroom is I would ask everybody, let me go back a few steps, who in the classroom works in primary industries? Who's a farmer, let's say? I'd ask who works in the secondary sector, who's works in construction or in a factory. And I'd ask who works in the tertiary sector, who works in as a cashier or in education. And typically I might have like maybe one person in the secondary, primary, and then everybody else in the classroom works in the tertiary sector. And that's really true of North America. And that's what I want to highlight here, that nowadays, vast majority of people work in the tertiary or the service sector. And a declining number of people are working in factories or the secondary sector. And the primary sector is extremely low. Even though we produce a lot of food, we don't have a lot of people working in agriculture. And we'll talk about why that is. So if you look at employment change, this figure is a little old, but you have an increase in the tertiary sector. The secondary sector is a smaller part, and the primary sector is just a little tiny bit and declining over time. So since 1970, the growth of employment in the US has really just been in the service sector. So let's talk about some of the history and go back a bit. So we have the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, and the US was a leading industrial power in the world since the Industrial Revolution. We were, part of this sort of first wave of industrialization. It starts in Europe, but pretty quickly diffuses to the United States. And one thing notable is the urban system that we, through railroads and other technologies, we had these interconnected cities that were industrialized. And the biggest concentration is here. This is called the manufacturing belt, the industrial zone in the northeastern United States, and a little bit in Canada as well. Also often called the Rust Belt now, because where manufacturing has declined, that's led to, a decline in the population of some of the cities in this upper Midwest region. Let's take a closer look at that. So you've had urban growth in places like California, the Pacific Northwest, and this big block here, this industrial area of the United States, and a little bit into Canada, including this area called the North American Manufacturing Belt. Sometimes this gets called the Rust Belt, and these are places where a lot of people have lost jobs. And you can even hear this, we're coming up on, when we have seasons where we have political elections, we talk about like displaced workers in places in the Rust Belt. That would be like in Michigan and Ohio and in Pennsylvania, parts of that, because these are places where since the 1970s, a lot of the industrial jobs, the factory jobs, have declined and been offshored over time. A couple of things I'll point out too. You also have where there's a lot of the new types of jobs, like technology jobs, like in the Silicon Valley here, or in parts of Texas and parts of the eastern U.S. You have where you have high-tech regions where you have a lot of new technology. Silicon Valley being the best and most familiar example. And just changes to our physical urban landscapes. So a couple of patterns that I want to highlight. You had one called suburbanization, where after World War II, like since the mid-1940s, you had people moving from the downtown areas out to the suburbs. So this is showing, I think it's Cleveland, Ohio, where prior to World War II, most people lived concentrated in the downtown area. And then as you get into, and with some streetcars, people started to move to a little bit further out. But after World War II in the 1960s, boom, people are moving further and further out. In Fresno, this would be like people living near, just in downtown in the 1900s. This growth would be like people moving out a little bit into, say, the Tower District in the 1930s. And this would be like people moving way out to Shaw and Herndon and beyond after the night, since, from the 50s, 60s on. Now, in some places, they've also been affected by deindustrialization. That's what we mentioned, where you have the automation and loss of manufacturing jobs because of automation and offshoring of work. That's been since the 1970s. And so if you look at this image here, what you see is that you actually have a decline in the number of people who live in some of these parts of the city because of loss of jobs. So many cities in that industrial Rust Belt area actually have large parts of their cities that have been abandoned, or you have vacant housing because so many people have left due to lost jobs. So let's take a quick look at this again. This is using Cleveland, Ohio as an example. 1900, if you don't have, you have to walk to work basically, so everybody lives now downtown, mostly concentrated. As you get into the 1930s and you have things like streetcars, people can, be able to live a little bit further out of the, from the middle of the town. And then you have, after World War II, you have suburbanization, where more people are living further and further out, as highways and automobiles are the technology that allow them to commute to work. Like we do now. We commute, we're out in the suburbs of the Fresno metropolitan area. At the school anyway. I don't know where we are virtually, but then with deindustrialization, cities in places like Ohio have kind of depopulated in certain parts of their city. And lastly, one thing that we pointed out in that chart is that you have very few people working in primary industries. However, the paradox is we are producing massive amounts of food despite having very few farmers. And a lot of that is because, well, we call it a primary industry. Farms are like factories now. I mean, they're highly automated. You have, you have so much technology involved that it's really hard to make that it's not a labor-intensive thing where you need a lot of people doing it. You need fewer and fewer people all the time as technology kind of fills in that gap. You have a lot of automation that takes place within the primary sector of agricultural production.